here we are for another CSM interview. And once again, before we get into this, I'd like to remind you that I'm doing this so that everyone out there can make their decision on who to vote for, but more importantly, so my management team at Warm Life and my community team at Eve Rookies can decide who we are going to be putting on the ballot for CSM20. And with that being said, without further ado, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little about your time in Eve.
Okay. Well, my name is MILINT Arc Trooper. I have been in this game since 2020, during the start of the scarcity era, and I got to experience this game from its older variations to today. And I have had a lot of experience more as a solo player, and I have actually got to do a lot of different materials, got to interact with people. I've got to see a lot of the changes that's gone through Eve, and my perspective of Eve is kind of developed around being a solo player, single account, and getting to try out and grind my way up through to about almost over 300 million skill points to see various actions and parts of the game.
And you are coming back for another round of CSM. I know that you went out for it last year for CSM19. Is your campaign staying the same, or have you expanded upon it? Tell us about your campaign points.
Well, this particular point, 3 points, is that right now, where Eve is coming into an era of change, which I believe there's going to be a lot more drastic changes. So I'm still in the thought process of supporting the exploration and hauling groups in Eve, which also then feeds into later the, mining and also PvP, because everything is, you have to have a good foundation for the game. But I'm also advocating for experimental, and mechanical changes that could probably benefit the game totally. And with the upcoming update, it's actually kind of funny because we've had some very deep and actually probably a little bit controversial and very heated discussions about different ideas and concepts for Eve. And uh, actually, a lot of the drawings and materials have been showing up on both Reddit and also now on the Eve forums with Eve forum post, which I did for my CSM, is based upon my experiences in looking at various different mechanics fairly closely and seeing the different gaps and holes in the game that could possibly be filled. There's been other interviews where we've actually had a lot of people actually pointing out, yes, he's actually got a good point because there's a lot of stuff that could be filled instead of whack-a-mole with the newest meta balancing, which is still important. But my viewpoint is, adding new materials, being adaptive, and also, let's have some experimental concepts so that, we can see what we can do to add to Eve and to make Eve more interactive and interesting to bring it. And we're also seeing some updates where a lot of the things that used to be in Eve are now coming back, um, which does ask some interesting question, but it's new ideas, make sure the foundation of the game is solid, and then, getting the new players in with some unique ideas and concepts that will actually both renew content for old and new players at the same time.
Cool. So, speaking of new players, I have a bunch of questions that kind of surround new players, but also existing players and maybe even veterans. But first off, what do you think the biggest barrier is to getting new players to undock?
I think if you actually were to get the new players to actually play the game, a lot of people get confused. I'll be honest with that because I've actually seen a lot of players, even in the Eve Discord. The Eve Discord is notorious for the amount of new players that'll pop in, just absolutely completely confused. Or they'll have a bug that happens in one of their missions where they don't understand how to do the processes. CCP has added new things that help out, but I think the problem is like they get overwhelmed and there's a lot of things that are kind of counterintuitive that doesn't help the players to complete things. Now, once you're outside of the new player experience, the problem also is, and hopefully we'll see, because what I'm waiting for is to see how CCP has done the changes to mining, because the scarcity era really discouraged new players from trying to build their first new ship, because now you had to go to dangerous places like Losec in order to get certain resources in order to build the ship. But hopefully, with the addition of high-sec mining anoms, which will probably bring small amounts of isogen and other materials in, that would allow players to start to build again, even though it may be limited, but it would give them a chance to build my first ship, do my first things, and then figure out how to do it. But I think that's the primary thing first is just the basic starting. And that can overwhelm a player. And then once they feel like they're too much time for so little, that becomes a problem. Now, granted, I'll say this: Eve Online is not as severe as Eve Frontier. Eve Frontier system is so hands-on that it makes Eve Online's onboarding process look like a breeze in the park. I hate to say it.
Oh, wow. So then,
and
oh,
mhm.
go ahead.
and so my thought process is let's make it easy enough where people can intuitively, a lot of the things that need a new player needs to start need to be intuitive. They need to be able, okay, this is what I need to do, this is how I need to do it. um, a lot of the guides even now do not make sense, like for how ships function. Like we have videos now in game for like ship functionality and weaponry, but it doesn't really give a good grasp of the mechanics of those particular systems. It needs to be intuitive, like, okay, I can figure it out. But then as you go into more complicated matters, the hand holding kind of drops off, and it actually you're promoted to think and upgrade and progress. The other problem in the game is that progression right now is very broken because there's not a benefit to somebody skilling up. A lot of, if you actually go in the game and you look at a lot of the skills, it's just one and done. You basically do one skill and everything's unlocked unless T2. And a lot of player, it actually, there's no reward track for like, oh, I went from frigate, let's say small weapons or missiles one. Well, I went to missiles one to missiles two. Oh, I have a new thing unlocked. Oh, and then I go to missiles three. I got another thing unlocked. And so like that's Eve as an MMO is kind of weird because there's a lot of stuff that, whereas other MMOs actually kind of have a onboarding track that actually rewards you as a new player to play in the game and actually encourages you and makes you want to discover and makes you want to modify things and skill up and craft up. The Eve system is very kind of, how should I say it, janky. And so it's like there's huge gaps of progression. So that's also one of the reasons why a lot of people get confused. They're like, what am I supposed to do? What things am I supposed to do and get in order to play the game? And people give a myriad of answers, and they put their hands up and they throw it like, I don't want to do it anymore because it gets overwhelming and things don't, they're not counterintuitive. There's no rewarding progress. Yes, CCP has done better with the new player experience. Yes, their system has like, oh, if you do all these little objects, you get all this SP and stuff. But even when they did that change, I even told them years ago, I was like, hey, people are going to abuse this system in order to get the SP, which now we've finally had fixed. But it was like 2 years too late. So yeah, it's been interesting indeed.
So you're a solo player, self admitted.
Mhm.
What role do you think fleets play in player retention, if
That
any?
can be, they can be good in some ways, but also like for interactive materials, it's a great thing to have fleets. But I take fleets from a perspective where basically random people join up together. Hey, you want to go run this? Let's go together. And I just, slap together in this. I always enjoy that because that's more people invite me to stuff and I'm willing to, if someone invites me and say, hey, why don't you come and join us? Okay, fine. I'll roll up and whatever ship I've got, whatever silly thing I've got going on, I'll try it out and we'll roll. And fleets do help with the concept of social interaction. But when fleets start to devolve into basically multi-box, only one person controlled like 25 or so of people, you dilute the social interaction scale that keeps people in the game, and then at the same time, the fleets, um, basically you scale out new players from trying stuff because one player can now do I can get 5 alts or I get 25 alts or whatever number they want, and I can run all these content that normally is supposed to be like 4 or 5 separate players in this. But also at the same time, if Eve, if you didn't have fleets, I do also believe that there should be some content that either is, how should I say it, amorphous. So where it can either be solo or it can be small gang or it can be big fleet stuff that you don't have to have a fleet to run it, but at the same time, fleets would make it a little easier. Or, if you got a corporation running, you can kind of team up and work on that. I just think that right now is like, particularly like the ISEC, the new, Homefront missions, they're so rigid on fleet systems that it does, I mean, it's okay, but at the same time, it kind of locks out people from running because, like, once you get over a certain number of people in that site, you actually can end up with a basically yellow, we call it blinking mode, but basically suspect mode, which then can get you into trouble, and the fleet that or people are inside can shoot you, and so that can actually discourage content in a way. So it's like I understand the idea. I do like the idea of being able to just join up with groups. Hey, you want to do this? And get invited to do it. Let's roll. But also at the same time, I also think there should be a balance of let the solo players, let the new bros kind of explore things, and maybe there's something, oh, there's a high value single site that pops up, and they just so happen to get it, and then they're like excited because, oh, I got this really expensive item. Because, well, I was on there. So maybe CCP could do stuff where they maybe make a whole bunch of smaller materials that are just like frigate and destroyer only. And then what happens is, more of that, and that would actually allow some of the smaller groups, because there's people right now who run through HiSec and they just chew up everything. Like there's people that run circuits in the game right now. They'll scan down everything, knock it all out, and there's like nothing left for new players and other people to kind of explore and do because these people are just rolling through and just grabbing everything. So it's a balance. I think fleets are useful, they can be helpful, but I don't think they're 100% the whole reason to get retention, but they do play a major role.
Okay. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about toxicity. We talked a little bit earlier before we started the interview about the op in Providence with Absolute Order, where the
Mhm.
community got together and basically evicted Absolute Order. Now, what a lot of
Mhm.
people don't know, this has been going on for a very long time. It didn't
Mhm.
suddenly come up on our radar
Mhm.
summer of 2025. So,
Mhm.
what is your take on this? Do you think it was a good thing that the Eve community got together to evict Absolute Order? A bad thing? You're neutral. It was just content. So, yeah, what are your feelings on this?
Well, I'm going to take my perspective from this. Majority of this particular long form situation is that Absolute Order ended up winning the Aram Fanar War. Now, this is something that you won't see anybody talk about really much, particularly the Op 4. So, Absolute Order has been pretty much put into a corner since that situation. So, Aram Fanar was basically Absolute Order versus Parallax. And Parallax, the Parallax Alliance, which was a Russian slash Eastern European majority group, they operated in and around Mimitar space and the wormhole connections to Mimitar space. They had a fairly large industrial base slash stations, including a Satio that was in Fanar. So basically, for whatever reason, I'm not 100% sure what kicked it off, but Absolute Order declared war on them and moved into Iram in Mimitar space, set up 3 Astra houses, and then started a campaign of attacking and refing all of their stations and materials within the region, especially in Fanar. This led to about, I believe, if I remember correctly, 700 to 1,000 players joining in the final fight to destroy the Satio. And this is just before the extra large station changes. And it was interesting because basically, not only did Absolute Order and Company end up setting off tie-dye in Finar, which also showed some server issues because various systems that were because that actually showed some interesting characteristics of the server architecture. Because when Finar was tie-dyed, we were actually getting reports from different systems, not only within Mimitar space, but other areas in the game that were going to tie-dye as well, because the resource pool. And so what happened was Absolute Order ended up getting on both, I think, the monthly beat and also the ended up getting the scope for that time frame for destroying that Satio. And they were the largest fight in the game, ironically, and in Hisek for things, for a long time until the perimeter Keepstar was taken down. Now, after that is when it started going downhill because a lot of people were not happy about that. Now, the interesting tie in is that Governor Lee had actually contacted me because I was just roaming about because usually that area is my home base. He's like, oh, why don't you rule this area? I'm like, no, why would I rule Hisek? But then the interesting thing about it was that the whole fight and everything else went a little crazy. So the absolute order situation also is interesting because there's a interesting counterplay. The eviction has happened just before the CSM voting timeframe. Absolute order actually played a fairly major role as well for a certain number of basically votes. And some CSMs have actually benefited from absolute order, being a voting block when it was, kind of under the umbrella of other groups until they went rogue last CSM and tried to not only front one of their own persons, but vote as a block for that one CSM. And so there is a little bit of a internal game politics system situation. Now, in my viewpoint as well, is that the reason why I'm also going to say this as an aggrieved party, because people were trying to get me to go join Absolute Order. If you go on the Eve Discord, you can type in AO MILINT or MILINT AO or AO MILINT. You can do all kinds of this or MILINT join AO, and you'll find a very interesting set of, content commentary inside that Discord, just in general, but also in other little channels all around. And you'll find that there are people who are on the CSM who have commentary about it, and some of it is rather could be confused as being very spicy and toxic in itself. So the whole AO situation for me is that I'm actually happy that the situation has been resolved in a certain way because it also means that the people who in question who've been trying to train me up are now don't have a source to do so. But also at the same time, you have a interesting problem where the situation and how this was handled um, will have reverberations because the same tactics and strategies and propaganda, information terrorism that was used, we've kind of gone over a threshold. And I feel that if any group in this game becomes on the outs, this will be used against them as well. And so the we might actually call it a counter toxicity op has the potential of actually backfiring in the future, particularly for the people whether side uses it. So I'm going to say this: I'm just glad the situation has been resolved. But I believe now there is a rogue voting block that is going to want revenge or is going to wait and operate within the game and start causing problems. Or we're going to end up with, because it has been allowed and condoned, a lot of the concepts that happened within that campaign are going to turn around and end up being used on a lot of people in the game. And it probably will not end up benefiting the game totally in the long run. That is my perspective at all.
Okay, well, that's quite a perspective. Now we're going to jump into some CSM specific questions. The first one is if you could ask CCP, if you got into the CSM, for one quality of life change, only one, what would it be?
Hmm. You know, there is one thing in the game I'd like to see them absolutely change for once, and it's the orbit system.
Okay.
I know that sounds very silly, but the reason why is because if you actually play in the game and you play with the orbit system, you could actually do it with your newbies group. You can actually do this and do it repetitively, and you'll see what I'm getting at. So if you start a fight with two ships, and one's the attacker and the other one's the defender, you can loop in. So if you hit orbit, the attacker hits orbit, you can actually close in, like circle in on the defender. But if the defender wants to get away from you, so like you get transversal and orbit away, what happens is the ship goes straight out in a straight line to the exact distance before it then starts to rotate. But the problem is if somebody is attacking you or chasing you or pursuing you, you're never going to reach that. So you end up going completely straight, zero transversal, you're dead. But the way I would like to see it, I call it Fibonacci spiral because Fibonacci spiral it spirals in, while you can do the opposite, spiral out. So it just I really would like them to do that. Where quality of life for both PvP and a lot of other content would be get the orbit system to work where it spirals in and spirals out, to whatever distance instead of doing this really weird problem on the defensive. So people will at least be able to use it in an effective way.
Okay. So then, if you make it onto the CSM, what other candidates or candidate types do you think you want to work with?
I'm okay with working with people who want to do the exploration, new sites, or at least people who will have a much more critical, constructive thought process for uh, gameplay. So, like, we want to do some stuff, we want to ask questions, we want to see different ideas. We're willing to kind of go through and talk out the idea, and maybe let's see, well, can we find out, can this work here? Can this work here? um, at least have the honest discussions about, okay, well, we have this idea with this concept, and we have this idea with this concept, and then we do the pros cons of it. But also, we can also talk to CCP if CCP's got an idea, and they're like, maybe this could work. Can we modify this? I'd like to hear it where people actually talk out the problem and maybe see what it is. Because a lot of the balancing changes recently, there are some balancing changes. I'm like scratching my head. I'm like, you didn't need to do that. You just need to change one or two things, or the problem was in a different area that needed to be worked on, and then the decision for whatever balancer is completely alien to the actual gameplay of the game. So I wouldn't mind working with people who have ideas with fitting and industry and other stuff, and doing hauling or exploration, or even maybe making new sites that combat. I would like to hear it, but I would like to hear it where we have the discussion, we talk about it, and we're open to ideas, even sometimes different perspectives, and seeing how it works. And so I'm okay with with people like Mike Azariah. I think his perspective and his long-term use is really good. Some of the guys who have new player concepts are very interesting as well. So I'm willing to work with people. I know people say, well, he won't do anything. I'm like, I'm willing to work, but I'm one of those people I like to ask questions and see what we can do with it.
So, what do you think your approach would be to showing player support for your issues? So, for example, Mike or Mick Fightmaster has his Wormhole UN. I have two massive communities to pull from. Oz has his Twitch community that he does a massive poll with. What do you think your method is going to be?
Well, most of the time it's like take whatever item they're working on, pull it apart, see how it works, both in the functional set of things. And people do like the ideas that I've had. There's some people who oppose it because there's an establishment in the game that they don't want to have things shaken up too much. But I'm willing to, like, hey, let's try these ideas. Let's work with the ideas and concepts. There are people who want to see a little bit more options for fitting. There's some people that believe that the fitting mantra is a little too rigid, and they would like to see a lot more fits to come through. I think I could probably reach out to a much more broader base than most people, instead of just being in one particular corner. Um, and where maybe it's like, okay, well, people want to say, well, what do you think about this particular thing? And okay, let's go check it out. And okay, well, Then after looking at the feedback and then looking at what the players are talking about, it's like, okay, there might be a problem here, or there might be something interesting here. Could we try this? And that's what my thought process is. Let's test it. Let's experiment with it. Let's actually test the game to see what happens, and work from there. Instead of canned, dried, boardroom style approach.
Okay,
Maybe more hands on.
so then, of course, players will approach the CSM with all sorts of ideas. And some of them are pretty wild, and some of them are like, yeah, if I brought this to CCP, they're never going to take me seriously again. How do you think that you personally will handle players that bring ideas that you absolutely disagree with?
Well, here's the thing too, is that that's a thing that I actually will point out because that's also a problem that has shown up both in the Eve Discord as well, because is a group of people that they'll sit on anything that they don't like. And so there are people who actually have a megaphone and they don't want anyone else with a different idea to come close. We've had some weird things. When the first time I ran, we had a guy in Talking in Station. I was actually kind of surprised because Kenneth Field let somebody come on his. He didn't let me because it was so funny because I just was talking about ideas to put modules in that would actually allow more flexibility with the haulers, and that was what he didn't allow me to show up on his stream. And I really wanted to go on his stream years ago because I really respected him, and I got to watch him during the major, Goon versus everybody else fight, and I really liked his show. So it was actually funny because the thing that kept me from showing up on his show was me talking about, well, there are different ways we could increase the M3 of all the hauling ships to allow more logistics and different modules, and that was the falling out. But then he let a guy who wanted people to be able to completely jump from like lower nullsec into high sec on and let him have airtime, which just kind of made me laugh real bad inside. Um, but my idea would be this: if you have an idea, and maybe I don't agree with it, I'll ask questions and I'll put forward. I'm like, okay, so and work it out. Ask questions. Okay, so what's the reason and the thought process behind this change? How do you want to do this? Okay, what is the benefit that you want to do? Actually, ironically, that's also what CCP did on their Discord with one of the when they were doing ship balance. They said, why are you interested in changing this? What is your personal preference of this? And how do you think this will help other people? And so we want to have that capability to have constructive criticism, but also critical review of an idea, and then say, okay, well, and maybe even then, sometimes the person bringing an idea I don't agree with actually may have kernels of an idea that could be added. So, like a compromise of two different concepts or different ideas, or something even completely different new can happen, you know. And by virtue of that, it's like bring the idea, let's talk it out within. That would be from the player side inward, not from the CCP outward, because that would be against the NDA. From the players inward to CCP through the CSM. You go, you talk to them, you ask them, how do you want to do this? What are the thought processes? And kind of ask the questions that allows people to kind of look at it. And then if it seems like, and then if, like, let's say we also put it in like a player Discord where we have a poll or people are discussing it, then you can kind of get to a point where, okay, we've kind of whittled away all the really rough stuff, and then maybe, okay, this is the kernel of the idea that we want to use. And then that is, like right now, for whatever reason, I don't know why wormhole players are asking to do the exact same thing as nullsec, which I disagree with because that really kills off the uniqueness of nullsec. Now, I do think that there needs to be more variables in the game, in particular wormhole space, to make it a little more hostile and or to change it up a little bit so we don't end up with too many things being too static and getting boring. And maybe new content that could be moving through the wormhole space, but you as the player aren't really moving around as much. But you have to go look around this, like there's different play styles that can operate in there. But that's an example of thought process. Like I don't agree with the idea of turning wormhole space into nullsec space, but I understand why people want some change because it's gotten boring. So my
Stale.
discussion would be, okay, well, yeah, stale, yeah. And so it's like, well, why don't we have a discussion of what can we put in those spaces, and instead of having just one group rolling up and saying this is what we want, it's like, well, can we hear all the voices and see what different ideas we can add. I mean, I've always thought, I was actually surprised that Wormhole Space didn't have Concord roaming agents, because that's supposedly where they're keeping an eye on some things, or even SOE roaming agents, for special weird, wormhole only missions. I mean, stuff like that. But that's the thought process, is that, if we don't agree on something, let's have the discussion. Don't be shy about it. At the
So
same time, with the respectfulness. Yeah.
so then when you're on the CSM, you will be
Mm,
meeting with different teams once a week, and you'll have about between 40 and 45 minutes to meet with this team.
mm,
You have to work with 11 other people in order
mhm.
for everyone to get their say and be heard. How do you feel that this would work? How do you envision working with these 11 other people so you can make those 40, 45 minutes matter?
Mm. The idea would be probably, if I mean, the problem is that if the subject, they would also require a communication method that I think probably could be instituted both ends. So, like, if there is a particular item that they want to talk about, we have the information that, okay, we're going to talk about this particular item. We have kind of like a memo of, we're thinking about this idea. So CCP comes up, says a certain thing, and then we can have a discussion. If we're looking at the team, it's like, okay, we can set up, certain ideas and concepts in very small amount. And then if there is a discussion time, okay, well, we have this. I think it's a good idea here. And so, like, it's a memo system that would work, for communication and setting up and organizing it. So, like, if we have ideas, we can check off, information and talk with people, and it simplifies things, but also allows CCP a little bit more freedom to, well, we're going to talk about this. I'm going to add one new item. We want to do this, and then they can add a concept of question. So it'd be more about organizing, setting, and if I do have a question, or maybe we have discussion, then people can talk together and roundtable the idea out. If it seems a little bit more needing of time, because 45 minutes, yes, it's great if you're on memo organization, if there's any major problem, but in long term, a lot of things need to be looked at more carefully and tested, so that 45 minutes might be the way to do early. If we have another meeting later on, we should have a little bit of time to table some considerations, because you may have time to think about the idea that has been proposed, and then say, well, we've taken some time since the last meeting to think about this discussion a little bit more, and have a much more deeper discussion. We see some concerns, or maybe some problems. Again, NDA does limit how much external input on considerations. But within the CSM, we would have time to kind of mull over the thought process, instead of, jumping on that. So yes, then organization and just making sure that we very point and succinct about it would be probably important.
Okay,
But it requires organization.
so there is one issue that constantly comes up within the CSM, and I'm sure you have an opinion on this. Uh, Projection. I know
Mm-hmm.
that we worked on it where it was brought up a lot on CSM 18. I know it was on 17. I've heard that it was on 19. CCP actually enacted some changes this summer. If you were
Mm-hmm.
to get on CSM 20, would projection be something that you would continue to fight for to get a better fix? Or do you think it's good enough now? Or do you have opinions on how it should go?
Personally, though, I'm actually also going to put projection in a different light as well, because the ideas of projection, I think people use a very, very small perspective of it, and it is a problem that needs to be kind of looked a little bit more closely at. Because one of the reasons that a couple years ago I actually posted about that, where I talked about it, was, you had a form of projection where you were trying to tell people, like, people were like, oh, its projection's only this, and it's only the ansiplex. But to me, it's like, okay, the ansiplex is one of several major, things inside. And so it's like you have accessibility, you had connectivity, And you also have this because a lot of the problems right now is that a lot of people, unless you're dealing with the filaments, a lot of people can't penetrate, or like I call it penetration. Many people can't get beyond the first entry points of Eve. And so a lot of people can't even get there. And so, like, since Pochven, like, if you're over on the Mimitar side of the map, we lost a lot of connections to Nullsec. And so there's actually a huge dead zone on that side of the map that, you know, like right now is Molden Heath due to the changes. Also, and the other thing too is when CCP adds new content, like let's say Tibetzer and the Drifter conflict, there's now a choke point on that side where basically no one can move through. So Molden Heath has gotten very, very quiet. It was already quiet before, before scarcity. Now it's even much less activity in it. And technically, Molden Heath should be connected up to Angel Cartel space, and it also should have connections to deep. Besides the pipe from Epbringer down into Great Wildlands, there should be another connection, but we lost that because ScarCon got turned into Poachman. So projection to me is not just the nullsec side of it, where you can jump your Titan, your Anzaplex systems, or you have the connections like with Zarzag, where everybody went absolutely berserk with that because they didn't like the fact that somebody could just port from one side of the map to the other. Which I mean, I understand. I mean, personally, it should have been 3 layers in. So like one layer you enter, but you have to bounce through it, and then it goes to another layer, and then you get to finally to Zarzag itself. Then you go back through the layer system in order to get to wherever you want to go. That actually could have been a much safer system than what we got. But but that's the problem, is that any changes that CCP does for it is going to make it easier for somebody else, because once they figure out the mechanics, they're just going to strategically ossify in certain ways. So I would say I would change some ideas about it. I would also like to add where if I knew that you had an Ansiblex in the area and I have scouts and people moving around, we can attempt to hack and disrupt, hack your Ansiblex either to change its permissions so we can go through it, or we can like add a virus to your Ansiplex network, which then kind of makes the connections very unstable and or locked out for certain times. So you can actually disrupt players, which then forces things like Titans to be used for bridging or blobs to be used for bridging to move things around, which then adds targets on grid that you can go for or slows down response times. Personally, I would like to have seen the shipcaster being used because it could have been a much better effect concept, because if you had the beacons that you could place in systems, you could jump your ships from a location. You would have a limited range, yes, but you could multiple attack a position by the shipcaster through having multiple beacons on there, like 3, just in faction warfare, jumping through and then ending up, being able to multi-pressure an opponent on their grid. So projection could still have some changes. I think it should be more dynamic, and there should be ways to also screw with it, other than just sino jamming or you just shoot something because the refing is kind of silly. I would like to see things where we can affect changes in the game that make projection much more interesting, and possibly, if the issue persists with the Ansiplex situation, shortening the range, but also making it a lot more difficult for players to just, we can just put this in and we solve our problem. Because if you shorten the range, guess what happens? They're just going to try to build like more of those in order to get the same functionality. So the problem is you need to put tools that allow people to actively interdict and also to harass and disrupt. And right now we do not have that. And I think but I think the problem is most null groups don't want that, because then that means that they have to have active patrols with most of their groups, which, even though there would be more people out in space and shooting each other, a lot of them are very simplistic when they don't want to. They want to have simple command control systems, which means that they have less chances of somebody bribing, let's say, a patrol, and then suddenly their entire area is getting attacked and reft.
All right. Well, very interesting take on the projection problem. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, so we're going to go into the final thoughts. Why
Hmm.
should players vote for you, and why should my communities put you on our ballots?
Well, if you want experimental ideas, If you want new progression systems, if you want ship designs and concepts that will actually improve gameplay, and probably even some balancing concepts that will actually make gameplay more interesting and probably a little bit more dynamic, you'll probably want to vote for me on that one because you're going to want to have somebody who has a different perspective on things and also maybe looks at the problem and says, well, why don't we try this? Because if you have the same people that have been there all the time, there's generally a tendency for a specific mindset and thought process. So if you want change, if you want something different, you can put me in. And I'll do everything in my power in this. I can't promise you because the CCP will do what it is, but if you want somebody who will attempt the best he can to actually bring to the table new ideas and concepts that will benefit the game, I'm probably going to be your best bet on that thought process. And it is actually something of interest that I would like to see maybe sometime this. And even if I don't get in, I'm actually, we're still pushing forward ideas that are starting to have some effect. And it's going to be interesting to see how Eve changes in the next few years to the benefit of the player base. And I would say, says, I say vote who you think is the best on this. But I also think if you really want something with change, difference, and unique concepts that could actually probably benefit the game and breathe some, a breath of fresh air in, you're probably going to need to look outside the normal lines of thought process. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's it. Sometimes it's good to embrace change.
Okay, so if people like what they hear and would like to talk to you more about your platform or your ideas, where can they find you?
Well, most of the time it's either on Reddit or I am in the Eve Discords, etc. I was actually planning to actually build a newer Discord for certain materials, but I'm going to wait until see how the CSM goes through. But if you need to contact me, I can be direct messaged in various places. I'm usually in most Discords, so people can just usually at me, and I usually pop up. Jokingly, they say, "Have you some? Have I summoned? Have I been summoned?" um, but I think you can contact me, have discussions. I'm practically almost everywhere. But the easiest ways would be probably through Reddit and through Discord, and probably people will have a good time with that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming and doing the interview again this year, and best of luck for your campaign.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful day.